Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Matthew, chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. After getting into a boat, Jesus crossed to the other side and came to his own town. Just then, some people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." Then some of the experts in the law said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." When Jesus saw their reaction, he said, "Why do you respond with evil in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Then he said to the paralytic, "Stand up, take your stretcher, and go home." And he stood up and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were afraid and honored God, who had given such authority to men. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax booth. "Follow me," he said to him, and he got up and followed him. As Jesus was having a meal in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said, "Those who are healthy don't need a physician, but those who are sick do. Go and learn what the saying means, 'I want mercy and not sacrifice,' for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then John's disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples don't fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot mourn while the bridegroom is with them, can they? But the days are coming when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, because the patch will pull away from the garment, and the tear will be worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst, and the wine is spilled out, and the skins are destroyed. Instead, they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Was listening through C.S. Lewis's God in the Docks lately, and this was one of the passages that he used as part of his claim, essentially, that Jesus can't be just a good moral teacher. He either has to be a madman on the level of the one who thinks he's a potato, a bad man, in that he's trying to deceive the whole world, or he's God himself. You can't have just good moral teacher among that group because of what he said and what he claimed for himself. Take, for instance, Matthew 9:2 here. He says, "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." Now, if I have a fellow coworker who's complaining about being wronged by someone else in his life, and I say to him, "Don't worry, I forgive that man," that implies certain things. It implies I'm the one that's chiefly wronged by the other man's actions, which doesn't make sense. But what do we have here? "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." And what do the experts of the law reply to themselves? They say, "This man is blaspheming." They understand when Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven," that he's claiming to be God. He's claiming to be the one that's chiefly offended by the sins of the man. Excuse me. And rather than correcting their misconception, Jesus says, "Why do you respond with evil in your hearts?" Thereby not denying their assertion that Jesus is claiming divinity, but rebuking them for not believing that he is who he says he is. And of course, Jesus then backs up his claim by healing this man who had been a paralytic, and he went home. They brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. Other Gospels, in Mark 2 and Luke 5, explain how the man was brought to Jesus because of the crowds. His friends lowered him down to Jesus through the roof. This will be another example of Jesus healing the sick and diseased, and the Messiah's role as healer was clearly prophesied in passages like Isaiah 35, 5-6. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For water shall burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Thus Jesus' miracles were a testimony not only to the fact that he was sent by God, but that also he was the anticipated Messiah. However, as noted earlier, Jesus' miracles were not primarily calculated for crowd effect. Instead, they were primarily done to minister to the humble needs of humble people. For the most part, most Jewish people of that time would have preferred much more spectacular signs, like calling down fire from heaven upon a Roman legion. We also note that the presence of so much sickness among Israel was evidence of their unfaithfulness to the covenant and their low spiritual condition. God gave them the opposite of what he promised under Exodus 15:26. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Yeah, and the converse was promised if they turned their backs on God. Jesus saw the faith of his friends, not of the paralyzed man himself. It was evident that they had the faith to bring their paralyzed friend to Jesus, and their faith was active enough to take apart a roof and lower the man down before Jesus. The faith of the paralyzed man's friends did something. They brought this man to Jesus. Yet they only thought of bringing him to Jesus for the healing of his body. They certainly didn't think that Jesus would forgive his sins. But Jesus addressed the man's greater problem. As bad as it is to be paralyzed, it is infinitely worse to be bound and lost in your sin. We notice that they objected immediately, yet privately, saying it within themselves. Jesus will address what they said within themselves, showing that our thoughts and our opinions are open to God and of interest to him. Yeah, God, and only God, understands the thoughts and intentions of the heart. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, this alone should have been enough for Jesus to prove his deity, demonstrating that he could know their evil hearts. Yet he would also offer greater proof of his deity. But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. Jesus answered his own question before the religious leaders did. Since he could make good on his claim to heal the man, it gave proof of his claim to also have the authority to forgive sins. And he rose and departed to his house. The man was instantly healed, proving that Jesus did have the power of God, both to heal and to forgive. At the man's healing, the crowd properly gave God the glory for this miracle. Jesus obviously did not draw attention to himself by the manner in which the healing was done. And then you have Jesus calling the tax collector Matthew. Tax collectors were not only notorious sinners, they were also properly regarded as collaborators with the Romans against their fellow Jews. Nobody liked the man who sat at the tax office. The Jewish people rightly thought of them as traitors because they worked for the Roman government, and they had the force of Roman soldiers behind them to make people pay taxes. They were the most visible Jewish collaborators with Rome. The Jewish people rightly considered them extortioners because they were allowed to keep whatever they overcollected. A tax collector bid, among others, for the tax collecting contract. For example, many tax collectors might want to have the contract for a city like Capernaum. The Romans awarded the contract to the highest bidder. The man collected taxes, paid the Romans what he promised, and kept the remainder. Therefore, there was a lot of incentive for tax collectors to overcharge and cheat any way they could. It was pure profit for them. He was at this time busy taking, but he was called to a work that was essentially giving. When a Jew entered the customs service, he was regarded as an outcast from society. He was disqualified as a judge or a witness in a court session, was excommunicated from the synagogue, and in the eyes of the community, his disgrace extended to his family. The Old King James Version uses the word publican for a tax collector. The publicani were tax gatherers, and were so called because they dealt with public money and with public funds. A faithful publican was so rare that Rome itself, that won Sabinus for his honest managing of that office, and in honorable remembrance thereof, had certain images erected with this superscription, for the honest publican. Understanding how almost everyone hated tax collectors, it is remarkable to see how Jesus loved and called Matthew. It proved to be a well-placed love. Matthew responded to Jesus' invitation by leaving his tax-collecting business and following Jesus, and eventually writing this same gospel account. He left his tax collector's table, but took from it one thing, his pen. This man, whose trade had taught him to use a pen, used that skill to compose the first handbook of the teaching of Jesus. In one way, this was more of a sacrifice than some of the other disciples made. Peter, James, and John could more easily go back to their fishing business, but it would be harder for Levi to go back to tax collecting. There is archaeological evidence that fish taken from the Sea of Galilee were taxed, so Jesus took as his disciple the taxman that may have taken money from Peter, James, and John, and the other fishermen among the disciples. This might have made for some awkward introductions. Hey, Peter, I have a new disciple. Oh, I know him. Wonder if there was reconciliatory efforts amongst the disciples themselves. And then you have Jesus being criticized by the Pharisees for sitting down and eating with the tax collectors and sinners. The context suggests that this was a gathering of Matthew's friends and former business associates. We might say that Jesus took advantage of Matthew's decision to also reach those whom he knew. In noting that there were many tax collectors and sinners, Bruce estimates that this was held not in a private home but in a public hall, and that in any case it was a great affair, scores, possibly hundreds present, too large for a room in a house. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? The answer to this question was simple, because Jesus is the friend of sinners. But God demonstrated his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's interesting to me that you have sinners as one category, and then tax collectors on top of that, indicating the low thought towards tax collectors. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. This was the principle that the criticizing Pharisees did not understand. The Pharisees were like doctors who wanted to avoid all contact with sick people. Of course they wished that sick people would become healthy, but they wouldn't risk getting infected themselves. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Here Jesus quoted Hosea 6:6. In Hosea's day, God's people were still good at bringing sacrifice, but they had forsaken mercy, and they abandoned mercy because they gave up the knowledge of God and truth. God would rather have right hearts, full of truth and mercy, than sacrifice. This would be distasteful to men who thought they knew everything already. Oh, also, this is another passage where C.S. Lewis brought it up. Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? This man, Jesus, is claiming essentially that while I'm alive, there's no need to fast because the bridegroom is with them. During my time, there's no need to fast. What sort of good moral teacher is it that it's like, hey, just because I'm alive, there's no need to mourn type thing? He's clearly claiming to be God. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break. With this illustration of wineskins, Jesus explained that he did not come to repair or reform the old institutions of Judaism, but to institute a new covenant altogether. The new covenant doesn't it doesn't just improve the old, it replaces it and goes beyond it. Jesus' reference to the wineskins was his announcement that the present institutions of Judaism could not and would not contain his new wine. He would form a new institution, the church, that would bring Jew and Gentile together into a completely new body. Yeah, and I'm reminded of Hebrews with a change of priesthood requiring a change in the law. Anyhow, carrying on here. Psalm chapter 10, verses 16 through 18. The Lord rules forever. The nations are driven out of his land. Lord, you have heard the request of the oppressed. You make them feel secure because you listen to their prayer. You defend the fatherless and oppressed, so that mere mortals may no longer terrorize them. Yeah, contrary to the initial plea for help in the beginning of the psalm, you have great faith expressed in the Lord here at the end. Expressing the sovereignty of the Lord, saying, the Lord is king forever and ever. God had long been declared the king of Israel, even when his people rejected his rule. If David wrote this psalm, the words, "The Lord is king forever and ever," would have special meaning, recognizing the reign of God, even over the troubled and dysfunctional reign of Saul. You have heard the desire of the humble. You will prepare their heart. You will cause your ear to hear. This continues to express the calm confidence of the psalmist. God will not abandon the poor and needy, but will help and bless them. David does not say, "Thou hast heard the prayer of the humble." He means that, but also means a great deal more. Sometimes we have desires that we cannot express. They are too big, too deep. We cannot clothe them in language. At other times, we have desires which we dare not express. We feel too bowed down. We see too much of our own undesert to be able to venture near the throne of God to utter our desires. But the Lord hears the desire when we cannot, or dare not, turn it into the actual form of a prayer. With a wonderful phrase, "You will prepare their heart," the psalmist reminds us that the spiritual preparation of the heart is a great gift, an answer to prayer, and a mark of God's blessing. Surely none but the Lord can prepare a heart for prayer. One old writer says it is far harder work to raise the big bell into the steeple than to ring it afterwards. This witness is true. When the bell is well hung, you can ring it readily enough, but in that uplifting of the heart lies the work and the labor. To do justice, that the man of the earth may oppress no more. The psalmist ends with the assurance of God's justice applied to the wicked. What began with a sense of despair in times of trouble has ended with calm confidence in God's justice and victory. Under the rule of God, the day must come when the man who was of the earth may be terrible no more. These were the concluding words of the song, and they constitute a fitting answer to its opening inquiry. Ultimately, there's a day of judgment. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled completely, and your vats will be overflowing with new wine. According to the principle of the sacrifice of the first fruits, we should give to God the first and the best. If we will truly honor the Lord with our giving, it won't be with the last and leftovers. The principle of first fruits also means that we give to God an active anticipation that He will provide more. We honor Him by thinking, "I can give you the first and the best because I know you can and will give me much more." So your barns will be filled with plenty. This is a wonderful principle. God is the master and distributor of unlimited resources. He knows how to prosper and take care of those who honor Him with the resources He has given to them. And it's important to exercise this giving in the Christian life, to give back to God what He has given to us. But mind you, again, this is Proverbs and isn't a absolute rule for all of life. That is, give to God and you will have barns that are overflowing. But more of a general rule. That is often exploited by prosperity preachers who say, essentially, if you just give more to me, then God will bless you. So, anywho, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day.